Welcome to Cybersecurity Luminaries, History and Heroes, a series aimed to highlight the profession's humble beginnings and the men and women who paved the road for all of us. This series is brought to you by Candy Alexander and Cailin Sullivan, your co-hosts from the Cybersecurity Refined and Feral podcast.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Cailin Sullivan. Welcome to Cybersecurity Refined and Feral.
And I'm Candy Alexander. As part of our cybersecurity history series, again, it's a project that I have been wanting to do for some time. We're looking to really shine a light on our luminaries in our profession. And of course, we're calling this series History and Heroes. So today we have our very first hero, Spaf. As you may know him. Cailin, why don't you go ahead and introduce Spaf?
So today we're going to be talking to Spaf. He is the first director of the Center for Education and Research in Information Assurance and Security at Purdue, former chairperson of the Association for Computing Machineries U.S. Public Policy Committee. And he was a member of the President's Information Technology Advisory Committee from 2003 to 2005, and an advisor to the National Science Foundation. Welcome, Spaf. How are you?
Hello. Pretty good today. Glad to be here with both of you.
Thank you so much. Did I miss anything of your accolades?
Oh, there's probably a few other things in there that I've done, but if people are really curious, they can search it out online.
That is true. So we have a couple questions. Like my mom said, we want to kind of get into your background. What was your job before you started in information security?
Well, in one sense, I started in an interest in information security when I was in high school. So I guess my student would have been, being as a student would have been my job. I've had some part-time positions while being a student, and but effectively went through after I really started in earnest on my undergraduate degree, on to my graduate degree, and then a postdoc, and then ending up as faculty at Purdue. So my career has largely been in academia. I had some other kinds of things along the way. I had a year and a half before my undergraduate time when I was actually working in a service industry, trying to decide what it was I wanted to do with my life, which many people do. But really, once I focused in on the academic aspects, that really defined my career.
How was it that you decided that you wanted to go down this route in the first place? Was it like you were interested in computer science at first? Like, what was the lead in?
I've reflected on this often, and it's difficult to say exactly all the influences. I know family issues shape one and one's views. As time has gone on, I've come to appreciate a bit more the influence of my parents. My mother was a teacher and certainly had me interested in education for quite some time. My father was involved with finance. He was an accountant. I think some of my interest in math came from him. He also some of their experiences growing up. My father served in World War II and was involved with helping to free some of the places where atrocities had taken place. And that had a big impact on him and indirectly on me to this day. I have a great dislike for bullies, and my uncle was in Army intelligence during World War II and the Korean War. He gifted me with a book, um, the a book on cryptography when I was, I think, in junior high, and that sparked my interest in that.
Mhm.
Then in high school, I took a computing class with very early computer, and those two things generated some interest, but not really the direction I wanted to go into.
Mm.
It,
Yep.
it wasn't until I was an undergrad and took some classes in computer science that I said, this is where I want my career to go. And then my interest in cybersecurity developed over time. Uh, my undergraduate work was in computer science and mathematics, and then I went into grad school. I got interested in research. My research was oriented towards reliable systems.
Hmm.
So I was concerned about people depending on computers that might fail. So I did work in reliability of computing systems. Then I did a postdoc in software engineering because I realized that faulty software was the cause of many problems. I started my career as a faculty member at Purdue University, working in software engineering and reliable distributed systems. And after a couple of years, I had been, I would say I was a hobbyist interested in security rather than as a formal study field. But I began to get more and more interested in the fact that failures could not only be introduced by poor software, but on purpose. And I started focusing my research in that direction.
Mhm.
The timing was good, it took off. And so my career has largely been shaped by those forces. I wandered into this, and it's been a great place to be.
So my question would be, because I've been in it a couple of years myself, and I remember there not being a lot of options in higher ed for the study of cyber. And of course, back then we called it either software engineering or you called it information security. And there was no degree programs by any means. So, what kind of offerings do you recall there being back in that time frame for information security?
Very good point. So my undergraduate education and graduate education were at the tail end of the 1970s and into the 1980s. And at that time, computing was still largely dominated by larger computers that were shared by groups, and they
Yep.
were expensive.
Yep.
So the research that had been done at that point was largely for financial institutions and the government,
Mm.
defense related. And as you said, software engineering, the idea of building correct programs, was of major interest to those organizations. In particular, some of the work that was done in the more theoretical aspects had to do with information flow and covert channel kind of issues. There was also work that was done in cryptography.
Hmm.
And so those were, and the software engineering aspects that by the point I was ready to be involved was really more focused on formal methods, formal verification. So those were very theoretical, very mathematically oriented, which I could follow, but I really didn't find it very exciting. So I didn't work in those areas while I was a student.
Right.
Uh, there, there were I was working in software engineering. I was working more in testing and development methods
Yep.
um, because formal methods weren't practical then, and they still have limited applicability to many instances. So it was important to try and develop methods, and I found that to be interesting and challenging. And it wasn't really until I got on the faculty here that it became an academic pursuit that it was possible to get students, get funding, get publications, which are the things that academic faculty need to have to advance.
Right. Right.
So, long answer to a short question, but hopefully that gives
So
you a sense.
yeah. So when would you say it became more common to see true information or cyber, programs brought into higher ed? Because I mean, let's face it, it's really not that new. The degree programs, or majors, they're really not as old, if you will, or have been around as like software engineering and some of the other technology, paths. So, do you recall that coming about, and becoming more, common?
Um, so there was a kind of a sea change in the field in the late 1980s as computer viruses and computer worms
Yep.
began to get out more, and there was greater usage of uh, PC class machines on local area networks. So those systems didn't fit the traditional models, the Orange Book models and the like that had been done.
For
It,
reference, so the Orange Book, because you're bringing up another point of history, that was a part of, if I recall correctly, the Rainbow series, the book
yes,
called the Rainbow series, and each book had a different color for a different purpose. And the Orange Book was on security of computer systems, correct?
yes, it was a trusted systems evaluation criteria.
There it is.
It was basically the sense of what was required to build a trusted system at different levels of trust, and that was particularly oriented towards confidentiality rather than other security properties. So that began to generate interest in industry, and as the marketplace was changing. Then in the early 90s, I think 93 is when we switched sort of from the early internet being research oriented to allowing commercial activity. I presented some testimony before a congressional committee in, I believe it was 96. And I had done some research about programs at that point,
Mhm.
and there were only 4 graduate programs in the US that were doing anything in the area of cybersecurity, computing security, that were identifiable.
Right.
And we were producing at that time a total of about 3 PhDs a year, one of whom would return to his or her home country because they were foreign nationals,
Hmm.
one who would go into industry or government, and the other one, about 50% of the time, would go into an academic position. So
Right.
we really didn't have an academic environment.
Right.
Um, Shortly after that testimony, one of the 4 programs that I testified about at the time shut down, and the faculty went elsewhere. And because of that, I was involved in some discussions with government officials and congressional staff. And 2 programs came out of that I had suggested in my testimony, not quite the same as I had suggested them, but one was the Scholarship for Service program. Another was the uh, Centers of Academic Excellence program
Mm.
that was started up.
Yes.
And actually, a third one that came about was the Cyber Trust program through NSF that gave research funding. So it was a result of those set of things, that plus the industry interest, the outside interest in hiring and the like,
Yeah.
that really contributed to the growth of the field. And I would say that within about 3 to 4 years, we were up to a dozen identifiable programs, and then it's just continued to grow since then.
So, One thing I would like to go back to in regards to history, and I don't know where exactly it would fall in your timeline, but of course I've read the books, right? And so I'm going to mention a name, and Robert Morse.
Oh yeah,
Did you
yeah.
were you involved? Did you get impact by that? And if you could explain to our audience what it is exactly that you and I are talking about.
Well, there actually were two Robert Morrises
Oh,
of note.
yes,
Um, Robert Morris, the senior,
yes.
was a researcher at Bell Labs who then went on and became chief scientist at the National Security Agency and did research in a number of things, including cybersecurity. His son, Robert T. Morris, was a student, a graduate student at Cornell University, and had also spent summer at Bell Labs, and had written a piece of malicious software, of self-propagating software, that by all accounts, he didn't intend to cause damage. It was more a matter of curiosity, but
Mhm.
irresponsibly experimenting with it out on the open internet and covertly set it loose.
Mhm.
And he had some flaws in the programming that caused it to propagate wildly, and it crashed a number of machines. It was effectively denial of service on many networks, and spread throughout the very early internet. And this was back in 1988. The result of this, it made headlines in news media around the world. Many people had no idea what a computer virus was or a computer worm at the time. Uh, and it generated intense interest throughout the field.
Yes.
Uh, there were many of us who had been doing some work with antivirus, anti-malware work up to that point. Uh, we'd seen that kind of software for about 5 or 6 years up to that point, but then that really exploded the interest. The the result of that, in part, was not only some new research programs and renewed interest, but also a lot of copycats.
Yes.
Suddenly, people were aware this was possible, and they started writing their own. And we had, over the next few years, an exponential growth in the number of malicious software instances that were released on the network, local networks, and the internet at large.
Right.
So that really had a transformative impact on making people aware of what was out
Mhm.
there. And it took a little while, though, really to filter into the academic arena.
Yeah, because if I recall, at that time, um, networks were, it was not the internet. Like, for example, at that time, I worked at Digital Equipment Corporation. We were the largest private network in the world with, I can't even remember how many nodes in host. But besides like digital and major technology companies, then the other big network was the colleges and universities, correct? And that's where it was let loose, if you will.
Uh, um, in the late 80s, there were basically 3 or 4 major networks, major at that time. We
Yeah.
wouldn't consider them major now.
No.
One of them was based on DECnet.
Yeah.
There was the IBM BitNet that
Yeah.
was used for mainframe connectivities.
Mhm.
There was an X25 network that was telephony based in Europe primarily, and then there was the ARPANET,
Yes.
which was sponsored by DARPA,
Yep.
or ARPA, depending on what year you were talking about them. And that covered universities, some research labs, Bell Labs,
Yeah.
and a lot of defense institutions. And those 4 networks were the well, there was a fifth, which was Usenet, which was not, that was a store and forward. It wasn't an always on kind of network like the others were. So it was an early days of networking. The Morris incident, the internet worm incident, occurred on the ARPANET,
Hmm.
and that's the primary way that it spread. The other protocols eventually, after DARPA had gotten the TCP/IP protocol suite adopted, the other networks gradually faded
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
TCP/IP turned out to be have advantages and became very, very commonly used.
Yeah. So, obviously, that incident was quite historic, both positively, negatively, whatever. It was impactful. Um,
Yes.
so, in looking back at our collective history, what would you say was the most significant?
The most significant.
In regard, most significant to our history, so most impactful, most notable, and because of that, had put forth changes that in a positive manner, right? Because I've always been one to say that our profession is very reactive. I mean, just the fact that you talked about the history as you recall it, that it wasn't until some things happened and you did some testifying, then we got some programs in universities and higher ed. So we're very reactive as a profession, and that's how we grow. So, knowing the Robert Morse worm was one incident, what other significant incidents were as impactful, and what were the results thereof, if you could?
Um, I think one of the security incidents that was very significant was the set of intrusions that Cliff Stoll found and documented in the Cuckoo's Egg.
Yeah.
That was major, uh, as as something that caught on with people. Um, there were a series of released computer viruses in the mid 1990s that like Code Red was well,
Yes.
that was later. That was more 2001, I think. Um, that got more and more interest because it exposed vulnerabilities overall.
The Michelangelo virus. I remember
Yes, yes, that was one. The Y2K
that.
incident
Yes.
made people aware of why computers were critical in
Mm.
many kind of environments. Release of a couple movies. The movie War Games was certainly one
Mm.
that generated a great deal of interest. So we have a number of things that built both within the academic community where we got some interest,
Hmm.
and that lagged some the commercial realm, which is not unusual. The commercial realm, very often they find we have some pioneers, they develop products, they have ideas about what could be done. Some of the startups in that area don't succeed or don't, and they establish that kind of interest. And it isn't until businesses are really aware that those are problems
Yeah.
that those companies then begin to succeed. And so some of the antivirus companies, uh, the McAfee, Symantec, Sophos of of those times,
Hmm.
and then on the academic side, academia is generally very conservative. Not not everywhere, but what happens is that when something new comes along, very often people either try to claim it as part of their own or try to claim it's not part of what they do. So those of us in academia who were in the early days of working in cybersecurity, it didn't have the name then, um, many people were very dismissive and said, well, that's just advanced systems administration.
Mm.
And finding places to write papers and get them published and get people interested was a challenge. One of the sort of not the only person, but one person who had a very prominent role here, Dr. Harold Highland. Not many people know of him. Was the first editor and helped start the journal Computers and Security, which is still in publication. I'm currently the editor of that journal. That's the oldest cybersecurity journal out there. And that provided a venue for publication. That's where Fred Cohen published the first computer virus papers, for instance. And that began to establish that maybe this is its own academic arena. And then as companies began to ask for students with training and experience, that helped it. That was a demand signal that got higher ed to pay more attention. So there's a set of things, some small, some big, but it's more a question of what added to urgency. And I think where things like Cuckoo's Egg, like the Morris incident, like Michelangelo virus, where those started occurring, that's what helped prompt the demand signal.
Absolutely.
So I actually have a question. Do you think that like public visibility and understanding pushes businesses more, or do you think the businesses are pushing for like the considering like what impacts? Do you think that the public opinion is driving it and awareness, or do you think it's businesses that are driving it?
It's a combination. So, for instance, right now, over the last couple of years, I would say the private sector, the individuals, those of us out in the public, are showing more concern over issues of privacy of our data. Businesses would prefer to just have access to everything. They don't really care as much. And they care about it to the extent that they want to be in control of as much information as possible and not share it. But it's not a privacy issue. It's not an individual right issue. In the U.S. as much. It's been more of a concern in Europe because of historical reasons. But that is a signal that has begun to change legislation and investment in things in the U.S.
Yep.
And it's currently being very much highlighted by some of the, I would say, the very ill-considered actions by Elon Musk and his crew as far as government systems go. But people are becoming more aware that their information is there and can be used and misused in ways that they don't understand. So that is going to push more on industry. Some industry where they lose money. So, for instance, the development of SSL, which then became the more modern versions of TLS for security of web transactions, was because companies wanted to find a way to assure customers that they could safely buy things online. And it was industry that drove that. So it's an interplay. It depends on sort of where the focuses are.
I think one part you might be missing too, Spaf, is the fact that customer demands for privacy and or right safety, it often is through, I hate to say this, legislation, which then in turn turns it into, commercial application. Unfortunately, because let's face it, for years, companies knew that customer trust was down and just deal with it. That was the commercial response, to just deal with it. And it wasn't, I mean, for years, security professionals like us would say, well, you got to do this. This is how you protect a computer system. And these are the, minimal standards you should apply. And they saw it as a, not profitable. It hit their bottom line. It was a cost of that they were not willing to do. And it wasn't until legislation came about and made folks apply those standards. And whether it was, financial transactions over the, networks, or it be, other factors. But I think, we can't leave out that piece in that flow.
Yeah. Our legal system in the US is primarily reactive. It's retrospective rather than anticipatory. So we needed a certain level of loss, a certain level of public pressure. Usually, what happens in technology areas is that unless there is a national security issue, and that will bring federal attention,
Yep.
Within some states that are more advanced in that technology area, there's state legislation that occurs. So, for instance, California had some of the early laws. When industry is faced with laws that are established at the state level, they especially don't want to be having to spend money to satisfy several different states' different requirements. And so then they get behind legislation at the federal level to supersede all of those and have a federal legislation. Often it's less restrictive than what the individual states had initially passed. So we're seeing that right now with AI, that some of the first legislation really that was going beyond that of administrative rules was passed in California, or it was attempted in California, and a couple other states, New York, Connecticut, again, sort of more high tech states, and that will eventually, if enough of that catches hold, we'll see something at the federal level. We also saw some federal level responses to security around finances, for instance, because it was recognized that online theft and online diversion was being used to fund terrorists and fund regimes that we otherwise had various prohibitions against, such as North Korea. And that's another avenue that often causes legislation to get passed.
Yeah, that's
But
like Enron, I think, was triggered
yep,
Sarbanes-Oxley. Yeah.
yep. So it generally, again, our legislation, our national approach is generally reactive rather than anticipatory.
Agreed.
It's when we see national reaction to various kinds of things, whether they're armed conflict, it could be Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or whatever, or things like the COVID epidemic. We often ignore experts because it's expensive to invest in protections until
Yes.
we realize there's actually a realized threat.
Yes.
And then, of course, we end up spending a lot more because we have a lot to catch up on. Cyber is part of that.
And wouldn't you say that, I mean, like another thing I'd like to touch on is like repeating ourselves, right? Like the same lessons over and over again. And it seems as though what you just stated is something we fight all the time. Like, fighting for justification for spend, right? We have to, as professionals, cyber professionals, have to ensure there's an ROI, that it's put in business terms. And that's one of the challenges I think we have as security practitioners. The higher you go up in the food chain, is having that discussion with business to have them realize the level of investment that you make upfront is going to pay off, rather than trying to make up for it at the end. And it comes down to the old, it's easier to bake it in as opposed to bolt it on. And I think that's time and time and time and time and time again, we're running into that. Do you see an end to that cycle, or are we going to have to get really good at it?
Uh, there may be places in the world that their mindset there is better than the current U.S. kind of approach. We see it lots of places. So, for instance, we're willing to cut education and research to give near-term tax reductions, and the ROI there fails to anticipate what's going to happen in the longer term. And in businesses, the idea is shareholder return over the next quarter rather than even continuity of the organization over the next 10 years.
Right.
Security in particular is one of those things that it is a cost center, but not something that returns a profit. So if they're going to look at it, it is an expense. It's like insurance. They need it to help forestall losses, but it's hard to predict how much a loss might be without it or what the right level is. And there certainly is nothing that's contributed back to the bottom line. And therefore, an awful lot of people who are making business decisions are doing it for the wrong reasons. And what we do in security is, yeah.
Well, I think that's been one of the challenges I face in working, with businesses is to really think creatively. For example, to ensure that it isn't perceived as a cost, that it's an enabler of business, especially when we look at, going after a SOC 2 to help ease and expedite the sales cycle, right? So it's more of an enabler. So I think hopefully with a little bit of practice and creativity, we're able to, sell security, if you will, to the business to invest in. But it's just a tiring cycle of, well, let me explain and let me, try to have you understand why that investment is so important, as opposed to let's just worry about doing security patches later, and at what cost, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah. We don't have good statistical data. We don't have good metrics. That makes it more difficult. We can sort of say, well, if you don't do this, you could have a problem. And well, what's the risk likelihood? What's the risk appetite? How do we fit that in? We see this repeatedly. It has to do with, for instance, investment in new technologies of all kinds. And I think we're seeing that now in a lot of businesses, which are reducing headcount of experienced personnel in favor of often buggy AI systems. And they're not thinking in terms of what's the real long-term value or game plan. It's more like, oh, we can cut costs. And I think it's going to come back in that area, as well as security. That's likely to come back and cause damage to a number of institutions that are jumping on it. Cryptocurrency, blockchain, that's another area. And even some places that jumped on cloud computing, moved everything to the cloud. I've heard from many organizations that regret doing that because there are things they've lost that they were warned about, but for whatever reason, they decided that the short-term benefits were more important.
Or, and a famous one in regards to the cloud is like, what do you mean you don't do backups of my cloud data?
Yeah.
Forever in the cloud, isn't it? So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have an uphill battle in part that those of us who are security professionals who have to interface at higher levels, as you said, of convincing management, we need to understand something about what their value system and vocabulary is. We need to have better metrics. I've been arguing this for decades. And it's very difficult because it's a squishy kind of thing. When we talk about security, different organizations have different ways of defining what that means.
Yeah.
A bank versus a defense department agency versus somebody at home, a user, all have different definitions and levels. So it's difficult to collect data and present it in a way that's going to convince decision makers. But we have to get better at this if we're actually going to be able to build some of the defenses we need to build.
Yeah. I mean, people can't even get questionnaires right. Like, they send manufacturing questionnaires to my SaaS company asking about, like, environmental hazards. So if we can't even get questionnaires right at this point, like, it's going to take quite a while to get all that ironed out.
It is. Well, we don't even. We're getting to the point where we have some shared terminology about things,
Yeah.
but it's still a little vague. The basic education that's necessary is lacking. We have a lot of people who are working with systems who, uh, frankly, their educational attainments, their comprehension is at a level far lower than those who are attempting to set the policies or the mechanisms, and understanding the reward and value systems. Uh, an example I just presented to my class about a week ago, for example, is that in many organizations, if an individual clicks on a malicious link in email, a phishing link, uh, and reports it, they are disciplined.
Oh, no, not my company. Mm-mm.
Well, there are some that are out there that still have
Oh,
that,
yeah.
because security personnel, it's like, you're not supposed to do that. Why did you do
Mm.
that? And of course, what that does is create a climate of fear where people don't want to report.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have people who understand the technology but don't understand basic psychology and
Yeah.
management.
Yes.
Yes.
We have to get out of the mindset. And again, this is something I've been arguing for decades and now is beginning to catch on in a few places, that cybersecurity is more than the technology. It
Mhm.
has to encompass these other things. And there are still a lot of places that simply teach firewall configuration and antivirus and maybe intrusion detection and call that cybersecurity, and it's not.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
We just had a conversation with Win Schwarto, and I know Win very much feels the same way, that you need to teach, psychology and
Hmm.
all kinds of
Sociology.
complementary, because you're dealing
Yes,
with humans. So
mostly. uh,
Yes.
that's the
Hopefully.
yes.
problem.
To jump back to some more technical type issues, what what technical issues are you surprised are still an issue today?
Um, I would say at this point, very little surprises me the more I understand, but I am troubled that we continue to use and reuse uh, bad software, bad systems,
Mhm.
uh, that the amount of reuse of old software is economic. That's why we use it. But even startups now just deciding that they're going to build something, an internet of something, and they decide, well, they're going to build it on Linux and import C libraries that have been around on the net for the last 20 years with all of the vulnerabilities and all of the flaws and errors and everything else that's in it without giving any thought to what that means. We've had a steady progression development of some much better programming environments, better testing tools and technologies,
Hmm.
but there is an expense on using that, and many organizations seek the least cost mechanism. So it doesn't surprise me it's happening, but I am really saddened by the fact that we haven't outgrown that in all of this time.
Yeah.
Uh, it leads to problems,
Yeah.
and uh, we also, I think, have failed to embrace the idea that building systems is really a kind of an engineering discipline, even though we talk about software engineering, where what we produce should be viewed as fallible. It's still the case that most people, when they write code, even if they've been doing it for any length of time, believe that what they've written is likely correct. And they don't write it defensively. They don't write it with the mindset that it's probably wrong, which it is usually the case, even for the best coders, present company excluded. But as a result, they fail to build in the kind of defensive measures. They fail to do the kind of testing, fail to do the kind of design that really should be present in things that we're going to eventually deploy in critical places, particularly when we talk about code reuse and code sitting around for decades. So that's another thing that I am despair a little bit. I'm not surprised by it. I understand the economic and psychological reasons behind it, but it's one of the things that I wish was different. So those are two.
So along those same lines, I guess the last question I'd like to ask of you, and then I'd like to move into other heroes. What words of advice do you have for people in the profession today, based on lessons learned throughout our collective history and all of that? What would you really like to leave people with for advice or words of wisdom?
So I think there's a couple things that I'll try to mention quickly. One is that people working in this field should understand that they're working in an area that not as many people understand as they do, and they have a duty to try to achieve a higher level of attainment. I think organizations that work with software professionals, ISSA, ACM, ISACA, all have codes of professional conduct and ethics, and promote the idea of continued education and the importance of what we do. Every professional should be aware of that, and I would suggest membership in many of these organizations for people working in the area to help them with continuing education and being part of that community. It's our duty to try to do more than just the minimum to get by. And that means to also try to educate the people directing us that it's better to do more than just the minimum, even if it takes a little longer to do it. So that's one. And that extends into other things as well, which means continuing education to understand what's going on, what the problems are, learning about better tools, better techniques, and trying to use those, being better about reporting problems where they appear. The book that I just co-authored a year and a half ago, Cybersecurity Myths and Misconceptions, is about things that may have been true at one point, or that people sort of told themselves were true, but they haven't bothered to rethink or educate themselves to realize, no, they don't really apply. It turns out there's a lot of these things. And you look at our history as a software profession, as a computing profession, which is only about 60 years old.
Right.
It's not really like physics or medicine or anything that's been around for a long time. And we've accumulated a lot of these folk tales and a lot of these misconceptions. Sometimes the technology's changed out from under us. Sometimes we've gained more experience. But we still have people who are beholden to these ideas. And it really is important that those of us who are trying to push the field forward get away from those and educate ourselves as to what is possible rather than what's cheapest. So that would be my summary statement of where the field needs to go. It's not a technology issue.
Right.
It's more a professionalism issue.
I appreciate that very much. And very, very rarely I fear it is not a technology issue. It's people. It's the people, it's the processes, and then it's the technology. The old cliche, right?
Right. It's a cookbook. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, so again, since this is our cybersecurity luminaries, heroes, and history, so I'm going to throw some names at you, and I would like to have you share with us what your memory is of that individual. So first up, Howard Schmidt. When I say that name, what do you think of?
Oh, Howard was a good friend who was a big advocate for the proper use of technology. He certainly, that was influenced by his career in law enforcement, but he also worked really hard to try to professionalize the area. His work with a number of organizations, including I mentioned ISSA, his time at in government. Um, yeah, he always was a big advocate of doing things the right way.
Agreed. Gene Schultz.
Gene was a good friend. He helped me get Sirius off the ground. When I started the program here, actually before Sirius, it was I started offering cybersecurity courses. Gene talked his employer into letting him move here to West Lafayette, and he was an adjunct professor here at Purdue for a couple of years, and helped me teach some of the first courses that we offered in the curriculum. Uh, he was a master instructor, not only for us, but for other organizations like SANS, and spent a lot of time out trying to help other people understand how best to use systems. He had a background in psychology, so he also added some insight into how people think about these things as well as the computing. So I really I did a lot with Gene and really admired his efforts.
Yeah, those two individuals actually, when I heard of their passing, they hit me the hardest. Thought, oh, the world of both of them. They were wonderful men. All right.
They also, both of them, I think it was really key. They always had time to talk to anybody, right? They were not dismissive, even though they were giants. Um, Everybody was the same. They would talk to anybody, and I very much appreciated that.
I think if I was to point out one characteristic that I try to embrace and emulate is that no matter who you are, what you are, to offer your time. They were full of grace, truly. They were wonderful, wonderful role models. How about we'll switch gears? How about Becky Bass? When I mentioned her.
Oh, yeah. So Becky has a special place in my heart. Uh, she was a dear friend. When she was at the National Security Agency, she actually funded my very first research project and my first graduate student. So in that respect, she was somewhat visionary, but a great sense of humor. She also was someone who charted her own path. She stood up to people in authority if she didn't agree with them, and many respected that. Some took affront, but she told it the way she saw it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was greatly admired by a lot of people, and they wanted to include that. She really sort of single-handedly seeded and pushed forward the community that was doing intrusion detection and prevention for several years. If it wasn't for her impact, that whole arena would probably be several years later in getting developed. And that also, because of the funding and because of her influence, did a lot to seed what was going on in academia. So she played a really pivotal role with what went on in the field.
Absolutely. And it's also should be noted. I mean, we talk about some of the huge luminaries that were founders in our profession, and she was like one of the few women.
Yes.
Her and Dorothy Deming as well. I mean, really remarkable ladies who just persevered and pushed forward. So that's just amazing.
Yes.
How about Willis Ware?
Willis was really sort of earlier generation than anybody else who worked in the field. He and I would say Jim Anderson were the two very early pioneers, and Bob Abbott were really early in this field. And he was widely respected in government because of some of the work that he did at RAND and then under DARPA and Air Force contracts. The Ware Report, what he did. He's the one who established the fair information practices that were then adopted by Congress. And he was really an amazing thinker. I had I had the honor of meeting him and talking with him on a number of occasions, and very thoughtful, understood a lot of connections of things. Um, we we owe a lot, and there were some others that go back into that period too. Don Parker is another one,
Mm-hmm.
but I think Willis is the one that, if we look at the things that he wrote and that he developed, have had some of the most lasting influence in the foundation of our field. If we go back and look at the Ware report now that he led, uh, it is still fresh and applicable to a lot of what we have today.
Amazing. Amazing. Absolutely. Amazing and magical at the same time.
Yeah.
And how about Jim Anderson? What comes to mind when I say
Uh,
his name?
Jim was sort of like your irascible uncle. Uh, he, he was gruff, but he actually wasn't mean. He was just, he had that kind of personality. Uh, he also didn't really tolerate people who had ill-informed opinions or bad intentions, and he was not shy about expressing it. But he preferred to work in the background. He was not so much interested in having his name known or giving talks or things like that. So he did a lot of things that had lasting influence. Like he chaired the Anderson Report group that did the follow-on to the Ware Report. He was the person whose early paper basically laid out how intrusion detection should work.
Yeah.
He developed the reference monitor idea. He did some early work in firewall testing, and a number of other things that you normally don't find because he didn't really write about them. He wasn't. He was sort of self-taught in many ways,
Yep.
and but at the same time, he was very willing to be involved and to help others learn about the field and appreciate it. So he was a great guy. I worked on a couple of projects with him, and so insightful. Just he wanted other people to get the credit for it. He was not interested in the limelight. He just wanted to get things done.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like quite the character. And then how about Mike Jacobs? What
So Mike just recently passed away. He was a leader in establishing the Information Assurance Directorate at NSF, or not NSF, NSA.
Yeah.
He was an early advocate for helping to structure NSA to not only learn how to protect systems, but also how to share that information out with the outside world. And back around 2000, he retired from the agency and spent time out as a consultant. He was one of the founders of the Cybersecurity Hall of Fame. And he also spent a lot of time mentoring and advising others about getting involved. He understood the importance for national and business security for cybersecurity earlier on than many others gave credit. So in the early days when, for instance, when the Morris worm hit, he was in charge of cybersecurity at NSA and directed people to have some conferences, get together to talk about that. Very important figure in the field, not generally known by most people.
Yeah. And I'm going to wrap up the list with someone I actually knew as well. And I put this individual up there with being full of grace. And that is Don Parker, which you
Oh, yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah, Don, some of us used to affectionately call him the great bald eagle of cybersecurity. And to put that in context for people who didn't meet, I think Don was about 6'3", and just bald as to use the phrase, as a cue ball. Don very early on had concerns about how computers were going to be used in criminal pursuits, and had extensive records and study and discussion on that. Did a couple books early on. looking at cybersecurity. He took issue with the government issues. So, for instance, when the Orange Book came out, um, he he actually developed an alternate methodology for how to evaluate security and argued
Yeah.
that we needed something more than what the government was trying to do.
Yeah.
And he also was a very early advocate, and I think this is important, for the area of computing ethics and cyber ethics. He worked with the National Institutes of Justice to produce one of the very first books on cyber ethics that had scenarios and training material. It's really one of the first books that I ever encountered on this topic.
Yeah.
And in discussion with him, this was very dear to him, that it was important that the people who were working in security understood others were depending on them.
Mhm.
And the whole concept of trust really depended upon having a common ethos. So he was another person. I've been so fortunate to be able to work
Yes.
with all these people,
Yes.
and they all were really influential and had those important views.
I think when, and to round out this conversation, I think, again, this is why I feel it's so important that we record this history, because we've had like unbelievable people that we are standing on the shoulders of, they laid the foundation for our profession, for the work that we're doing today. And each and every one of those individuals that we've just mentioned, they were so passionate, they were so giving of their time and their knowledge. And it's just, I only hope that for those of us in the profession today can emulate that, those qualities of being a role model and the contributions. Imagine what our world would be like if we could only emulate a half of what their characteristics were.
I'll add something else that crosses all of those people and some others that were in the field, and that is a kind of independence and persistence, in that the things that they advocated for were not always popular or understood, and were often pushed back on, or that's too expensive, or that doesn't make sense. But they persisted and were willing to stand up for what they believed in.
Right.
And I think that's another thing that we don't see enough of, that many people in our field are willing to just go along because of profit or political will. And it's much, much more important, again, for trust, for the idea of how do we trust people. We need to be able to take a reasoned stand, even if the headwinds are against us.
Well said.
The touch of rebellion.
Yeah.
When needed.
Right.
When needed.
Right. Refined and feral. So thank you so much, Spaf. It was absolutely wonderful to see you again. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and I hope that our listeners have begun to see the remarkable history that we have, and I hope that we can learn from this history and elevate it and move it forward. So again, thank you so very much.
You're most welcome, and it was great to spend time talking with both of you. Perhaps there'll be another occasion we can do another one of these.
I certainly hope so. So with that, we'll go ahead and close up. And as always, I would like to say to our audience, until next time, stay secure, stay refined, and
don't be afraid to get a little bit feral.